Karoline Leavitt settled into her first-class seat, only to be told she didn't belong. The flight attendant's smile was sharp, her words louder than necessary. "This isn't your place." Karoline didn't argue, just moved to economy, her calm unshaken, but that small pin on her bag. It wasn't just a trinket, it tied her to a name that could shake Washington. Why would an airline risk everything over one seat? Before we dive into today's story, if you find this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories. You're also welcome to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Every piece of feedback is truly valuable in helping Crossfire Justice improve. Thank you so much for always being with us. And now, let's jump into this thrilling and unexpected story together. The boarding call rang out across Dulles International Airport. A low hum beneath the shuffle of feet and rolling suitcases. Karoline Leavitt, a young woman in a neatly pressed blazer, moved quietly through the crowd, her boarding pass clutched in one hand. She settled into her first-class seat, the leather cool against her back, and let out a soft breath. This was a rare moment of calm in her whirlwind life, but before she could close her eyes, a shadow fell over her. Jessica Reed, the lead flight attendant, stood in the aisle, her badge gleaming under the cabin lights. Her smile was tight, almost performative. "I'm sorry, miss," she said, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to turn. "But this isn't your place. First class is for priority passengers." The words landed like a slap, sharp and public. Whispers rippled through the cabin. A low buzz of judgment. Karoline's jaw tightened, her fingers curling around the armrest. She was no stranger to scrutiny, but this felt different, personal, pointed. If you've ever been told you don't belong, you know that ache, the one that settles deep in your chest. She glanced at Jessica, whose eyes held a glint of satisfaction, as if she'd already won. Karoline's heart thudded, but she didn't argue. "Not yet. I have a valid ticket," she said softly, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. Jessica's smile didn't waver. "I'm sure there's a mistake. Please move to economy." The cabin grew quieter, the air thick with anticipation. Passengers shifted in their seats, some avoiding her gaze, others watching with thinly veiled curiosity. Karoline's hand brushed against a small eagle pin on her bag, a gift from her father. A man whose name carried weight in places like this. She could have pushed back, could have raised her voice, but she didn't. Silence, she knew, wasn't always surrender. It was restraint, a choice to hold her ground in a way no one saw coming. She gathered her bag, her movements deliberate, and stood. The weight of every stare followed her as she walked down the aisle toward economy. Her steps measured, her head high. Jessica's smirk lingered, a silent declaration of victory, but Karoline wasn't defeated. As she settled into a cramped seat by the window, the hum of the plane vibrating through her, she pulled out her phone. The screen glowed in the dim cabin, and her fingers moved quickly, typing a single text. She hit send, her lips pressing into a thin line. The older man across the aisle, dressed in a crisp suit, glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. He'd seen the exchange, heard the edge in Jessica's voice. Most others looked away, content to let the moment pass. But something about Karoline's calm, the way she carried herself, stayed with him. The plane's engines roared to life, and the cabin lights dimmed. Jessica moved through the aisle, her confidence unshaken. Unaware of the storm she'd just stirred, Karoline leaned back, her eyes fixed on the clouds outside. If you've ever been dismissed, judged for who you seem to be, you'd know what she felt: a quiet resolve, a spark waiting to catch. Her phone stayed silent, but she knew it wouldn't for long. The text was out there now, a ripple that would soon become a wave. Jessica thought she'd won, thought she'd put Karoline in her place. But what was in that message? Who was on the other end? Karoline Leavitt sat wedged between a snoring businessman and a mother soothing her restless toddler. The economy seat digging into her back. The plane's hum was a steady drone, muffling the chatter of passengers. But it couldn't drown out the echo of Jessica Reed's words: not suitable, not priority. They looped in her mind, each syllable a small cut. Why had Jessica singled her out? Was it her youth, her simple blazer, or something deeper, like the small eagle pin glinting on her bag, a gift from her father, a man whose name opened doors in Washington? Karoline's fingers traced the pin's edges, its cool metal grounding her. She wasn't one to snap back or demand respect. If you've ever been judged for who you seem to be, you know that kind of calm. It's not surrender. It's strategy. Most passengers avoided her gaze, their eyes fixed on magazines or screens, content to let the moment pass. But one man, older, in a crisp suit, watched from across the aisle, his brow furrowed slightly, as if he sensed something amiss. Karoline didn't meet his stare. She didn't need pity. She needed clarity. Jessica, meanwhile, moved through the cabin with a strut, her badge catching the light, her confidence unshaken. She paused to chat with a first-class passenger, her laugh sharp and performative, as if to underline her authority. Karoline's heart ached, not just for herself, but for every person who'd ever been dismissed like this, told they didn't belong without a chance to prove otherwise. She thought of her father, his voice steady over countless late-night calls. Never let them see you flinch. She hadn't flinched. Not yet. Her phone rested in her lap, the screen dark now, but the text she'd sent was already out there. A quiet spark in a world that moved fast. Who had she reached? Someone who could shift this moment. Someone who knew her worth. The plane tilted slightly, climbing through the clouds, and Karoline's eyes drifted to the window. The sky was a deep gray, heavy with the promise of a storm. She felt that weight, too, not anger, but resolve. Jessica's dismissal wasn't just about a seat, it was about assumptions, about power wielded carelessly. Karoline had seen it before, in meeting rooms and press briefings, where her youth and quiet demeanor made people underestimate her. But she wasn't just a young woman in a blazer. She was Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, a role earned through grit and loyalty. The pin on her bag wasn't just a trinket, it was a reminder of her father, a senator whose influence stretched far beyond this plane. She didn't wear that legacy loudly, but it was there, woven into her every choice. The older man across the aisle shifted, his eyes lingering on her now, as if trying to place her. He'd seen the exchange, heard the edge in Jessica's voice, and something about Karoline's restraint intrigued him. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hesitating over the screen. Karoline didn't notice. Her thoughts were elsewhere, replaying the moment Jessica had leaned in, her smile more weapon than welcome. Why had it felt so personal? Was it the pin? Its faint outline of an eagle tied to a political stance Jessica might oppose. Karoline didn't know, but she felt the undercurrent, the quiet clash of beliefs that sometimes spilled into moments like this. She leaned back, her head against the seat, and closed her eyes. The plane's hum steadied her, a reminder that this wasn't the end. Jessica thought she'd won, thought she'd put Karoline in her place, but the text was sent, and the wheels were turning. The older man glanced at her again, his phone now glowing as he typed something. The cabin lights flickered, and Karoline's fingers brushed the pin once more. Who was on the other end of that message? The plane taxied along the runway at Dulles, its engines a low growl that vibrated through the cabin. Karoline Leavitt sat in her economy seat, her shoulders pressed against the window. The world outside a blur of tarmac and gray clouds. Jessica Reed's voice crackled over the intercom, smooth and deliberate, welcoming the elite first-class passengers with a warmth that felt like a deliberate jab. The words stung, each one a reminder of the public dismissal Karoline had endured just minutes ago. She felt the weight of being singled out, the eyes of strangers flickering toward her before darting away. If you've ever been made to feel small in a crowd, you know that ache. It's not just embarrassment. It's a quiet theft of dignity. Karoline's hands rested in her lap, one finger tracing the eagle pin on her bag, its sharp edges a tether to her resolve. She could still hear Jessica's earlier words, not suitable, not priority, looping in her mind. But now they carried a sharper edge, a challenge she wasn't sure she was ready to meet. A younger flight attendant, Sarah, lingered nearby, her clipboard clutched tightly, her eyes flickering with unease. She was new, her badge slightly crooked, and Karoline caught the way she glanced at Jessica, then back at her, as if torn. The cabin was a hum of murmurs, passengers settling in, but the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Jessica appeared again, her heels clicking against the floor, her smile gone. "Miss," she said, her voice louder now, cutting through the cabin's hum. "I need to see your boarding pass. We can't have mistakes in first class." The words landed like a spotlight, and the cabin fell silent. All eyes turned to Karoline, some curious, some judgmental, a few sympathetic. Her heart raced, a quick drumbeat against her ribs, but her face stayed calm, her eyes meeting Jessica's without flinching. She reached into her bag, her movements slow and deliberate, and pulled out the boarding pass. It was valid, unmistakable. The first-class seat number printed clearly. "Here," she said, her voice steady, though her throat felt tight. Jessica took the pass, her lips pursing as she scanned it, but instead of stepping back, she tossed it onto Karoline's lap with a flick of her wrist. "This doesn't change anything," she said, her tone final, as if she could rewrite the rules with sheer will. The cabin held its breath. Karoline's fingers tightened around the pin, its metal biting into her palm. She could feel the weight of every stare, the silent question in the air. Would she fight back? She wanted to. Oh, how she wanted to stand and demand her place. But something held her still. It wasn't fear, it was the knowledge that words alone wouldn't shift this moment. Across the aisle, the older man in the suit shifted, his phone now in hand, its camera lens glinting as he began to record. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail. Sarah, the younger attendant, took a step closer, her clipboard trembling slightly. "Ma'am," she started, her voice barely above a whisper, but Jessica cut her off with a glance, sharp as a blade. "Stay out of this." "Sarah," she snapped, and Sarah shrank back, her cheeks flushing. Karoline's mind raced. She thought of her father, his voice echoing from years ago. "Choose your battles, but never let them steal your worth." This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about the assumptions behind Jessica's words, the unspoken belief that Karoline didn't belong, didn't measure up. Was it her youth, her quiet demeanor, or was it the pin, its faint political emblem, a silent provocation in Jessica's eyes? Karoline didn't know, but she felt the undercurrent, the clash of worlds that sometimes spilled into moments like this. She leaned forward slightly, her voice low but clear. "I paid for that seat," she said, not to Jessica, but to the cabin, to the passengers watching, to the older man with his phone. The words hung in the air, simple but heavy. Jessica's face hardened, her jaw tightening, but before she could respond, the plane lurched, its wheels leaving the ground, the cabin tilted, and the moment broke. passengers settling back into their seats. Though the tension lingered, Karoline leaned back, her eyes on the window, the clouds now swallowing the plane. The older man's phone was still raised, his thumb steady on the record button. Sarah stood frozen, her eyes darting between Jessica and Karoline. Something was about to break, a fault line shifting beneath the surface. Who would make the first move? The plane had reached cruising altitude, its steady hum a backdrop to the restless energy in the cabin. Karoline Leavitt sat by the window in economy, her eyes fixed on the endless stretch of clouds, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the sting of Jessica Reed's dismissal. The words "not suitable," not priority carried a weight that went beyond a seat assignment. They were a judgment. A door slammed shut before she could even knock. If you've ever been dismissed for no reason other than someone's assumptions, you know that quiet burn. The one that makes you want to shout but holds you still instead. Karoline's fingers rested on the eagle pin attached to her bag, its sharp edges a reminder of her father, a senator whose name could shift the air in any room. She didn't wear that legacy like a badge, but it was there, woven into her calm, her refusal to snap back. The cabin was a mix of murmurs and rustling, passengers settling into their routines, but a faint tension lingered, a thread pulled taut by the earlier confrontation. Sarah, the younger flight attendant, moved cautiously down the aisle, her clipboard tucked under her arm. She paused near Karoline, her eyes soft with something like guilt, and slipped her a bottle of water. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely audible over the plane's hum. Karoline met her gaze, offering a faint smile, the kind that said she understood Sarah wasn't the one who'd drawn the line. Across the aisle, the older man in the suit watched, his phone now resting on his lap, its screen dark but ready. He'd recorded the earlier exchange, and something about his steady gaze suggested he wasn't done. Jessica, meanwhile, stood near the galley, her posture rigid, her confidence still intact but fraying at the edges. She dismissed Karoline with such certainty, as if her authority could bend reality itself. But then, a chime broke the tension. Sharp and insistent, Jessica's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, her brow furrowing as she answered. "Yes, this is Reed," she said, her voice clipped, professional. The person on the other end spoke quickly, and Jessica's expression shifted. Her eyes narrowed, her lips parted slightly. "What do you mean?" "Check her name," she said, her tone sharp but faltering, like someone stepping onto unsteady ground. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, the hum of the plane suddenly louder in the silence. Karoline didn't move, didn't look up, but her fingers tightened around the pin. She knew who was on the other end of that call. The text she'd sent hadn't been a plea for help. It was a quiet signal, a single line to someone with enough pull to cut through the noise. The older man leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, sensing the shift in the air. Sarah, still nearby, clutched her clipboard, her knuckles whitening. Jessica lowered the phone, her face a mix of disbelief and defiance. She strode toward Karoline, her heels clicking, and stopped in front of her seat. "You," she said, her voice low but carrying. "What's your full name?" The question was a challenge, a last grasp at control. Karoline looked up, her eyes steady, and said simply, "Karoline Leavitt." The name hung in the air, unadorned but heavy. Jessica scoffed, a sharp laugh escaping her. "That's impossible. You're nobody," she said, but doubt crept into her voice, a crack in her certainty. The older man's phone was back in his hand, the camera rolling again, capturing every word. Passengers nearby began to whisper, their heads turning, the buzz of curiosity spreading. The twist landed like a quiet bomb. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just a passenger. She was the White House press secretary, a woman whose voice carried weight in the halls of power. Jessica's face paled, her hand tightening around her phone. But she didn't back down. You expect me to believe that, she said, her voice rising. As if she could shout the truth away, Sarah took a step closer, her eyes wide, glancing between Jessica and Karoline. The cabin was alive now, a current running through it, passengers leaning forward, sensing something bigger unfolding. Karoline's heart pounded, but her face remained calm, her voice soft but piercing. I don't expect you to believe anything, she said, but you might want to check with your supervisor. The words were a spark, and Jessica's eyes flashed with something like fear. The older man's camera caught it all, his thumb steady on the record button. The plane droned on, but the air felt charged, a storm gathering strength. Jessica turned away, her phone back to her ear, her voice lower now, urgent. Karoline leaned back, her eyes returning to the clouds. The pin glinted in the dim light, a silent testament to who she was. What would Jessica do when the truth hit? The cabin of the United Airlines flight felt smaller now, the air thick with a tension that pressed against every surface. Karoline Leavitt sat quietly in her economy seat, her eyes fixed on the clouds beyond the window, their soft edges a stark contrast to the sharp edges of the moment unfolding inside. The plane's steady hum was no match for the buzz of whispers that had begun to ripple through the rows of passengers. Jessica Reed stood near the galley, her phone pressed to her ear, her face drained of its earlier confidence. The captain's voice crackled through her earpiece, urgent and clipped, though the words were lost to the cabin's hum. Karoline's presence, once so easily dismissed, now loomed larger, a quiet force that seemed to shift the very air. If you've ever felt the ground move beneath a moment you thought you controlled, you'd know the look in Jessica's eyes, defiance fraying into doubt. Karoline's hands rested in her lap, one finger brushing the eagle pin on her bag, a small anchor to her father's legacy. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't demanded her seat back, but her calm was a kind of power, the kind that didn't need to shout to be felt. Sarah, the younger flight attendant, stood a few steps away, her clipboard trembling in her hands. Her face was flushed, her eyes darting between Jessica and Karoline, as if she could sense the fault line cracking open. Ma'am, Sarah said, her voice trembling but clear. Her ticket's verified. She's who they say. The words landed softly but carried weight, and the cabin seemed to lean in, every passenger catching the shift. The older man across the aisle, his suit slightly rumpled now, held his phone steady, the camera rolling as he murmured to his neighbor. Whispers spread, a low current of curiosity and outrage. Jessica's face paled, her lips parting as if to speak, but she snapped instead, her voice sharp with desperation. This is my cabin. I decide who sits where. The words were meant to reclaim control, but they sounded hollow, a shield cracking under pressure. Passengers' phones were out now, screens glowing as fingers tapped out tweets, the hashtag United Airlines already climbing the trends. Karoline finally spoke, her voice soft but piercing, cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. I didn't ask for special treatment, she said, her eyes lifting to meet Jessica's. Just my seat. The cabin erupted in murmurs, a wave of agreement and disbelief. Some passengers nodded, others leaned forward, their phones capturing every second. The older man's camera stayed steady, his face unreadable but his eyes sharp, as if he'd seen moments like this before and knew where they led. Sarah took a step closer to Karoline, her shoulders squaring, a quiet defiance in her stance. Jessica's eyes flicked to her, a flash of betrayal crossing her face, but she said nothing. The captain's voice came through her earpiece again, louder now, and Jessica's hand tightened around her phone, her knuckles white. Karoline's heart thudded. not with anger, but with a strange clarity. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who'd been pushed aside, told they didn't belong, judged by a glance or a pin on a bag. She thought of her father, a senator whose name carried weight, but also of the countless others who didn't have that shield, who faced moments like this without a voice. The text she'd sent had reached someone who could tip the scales, but it wasn't just about power. It was about fairness, about a truth that deserved to stand. The older man leaned toward his neighbor, his voice low but audible. "Her father's a senator," he said, and the words spread like wildfire, passenger to passenger, phone to phone. A second twist landed, heavier than the first. Karoline wasn't just the White House press secretary. She was the daughter of a man whose influence could shake institutions. Jessica's face twitched, her eyes darting to Karoline, then away, as if she could will the truth to bend. "That's ridiculous," she muttered, but her voice lacked conviction, and the cabin's murmurs grew louder, a tide turning against her. Sarah's hands steadied, her clipboard now held like a shield. She looked at Karoline, her eyes bright with something like admiration, and Karoline offered a small nod, a silent thank you. The plane droned on, its altitude steady, but the cabin felt like it was climbing towards something inevitable. Jessica's phone buzzed again, and she flinched, her fingers fumbling as she answered. The captain's voice was unmistakable now, even from a distance, and Jessica's face fell, her shoulders slumping. Passengers were openly talking now, their phones flashing, the hashtag United Airlines trending higher with every second. Karoline leaned back, her eyes returning to the clouds, the pin glinting in the dim light. She didn't need to speak again. The truth was speaking for her, and it was growing louder. How long could Jessica hold her ground? The cabin of the United Airlines flight felt like a held breath, the air charged with the weight of a moment tipping toward truth. Karoline Leavitt stood near her economy seat, her blazer slightly wrinkled but her posture steady, the eagle pin on her bag catching the cabin's dim light. The plane's hum was a distant drone now, overshadowed by the murmur of passengers, their phones glowing as they typed and whispered. Jessica Reed's authority, once so unshakable, was unraveling, her face pale as the captain emerged from the cockpit, his expression grim. "Ms. Reed, step aside. Now," he said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. Jessica froze, her phone still clutched in her hand, her eyes darting to Karoline as if searching for a way to rewind the moment. If you've ever watched someone realize they've misjudged another, you know that look, part defiance, part dread, a castle crumbling under its own weight. Karoline didn't gloat or raise her voice. She reached into her bag, her movements deliberate, and handed over her ID, the small card a quiet testament to her truth. The captain took it, his eyes scanning the name, and then he read it aloud, his voice carrying across the cabin. "Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary." Gasps rippled through the plane, a wave of shock and recognition. Passengers leaned forward, their whispers growing louder, phones raised to capture the moment. The older man across the aisle, his suit now slightly rumpled, kept his camera steady, the video already streaming online, racking up views with every second. Sarah, the younger flight attendant, stepped forward, her earlier hesitation gone. She held a printed directive from United's headquarters, her hands steady as she handed it to Jessica. "They're requesting an immediate apology," Sarah said, her voice clear, her eyes meeting Jessica's without flinching. Jessica's hands shook as she took the paper, her lips parting as if to speak, but all that came out was a stammered, "I didn't know." The words were weak, a shield that couldn't hold. The cabin buzzed, a tide turning, and Karoline's presence seemed to fill the space. not with anger but with a quiet power that demanded no shouting. She looked at Jessica, her eyes steady, and spoke, her voice soft but piercing. "This isn't about me. It's about fairness." The words landed like a spark in dry grass, and the cabin erupted in cheers, a swell of agreement from passengers who'd been silent until now. The mother next to Karoline clapped, her toddler bouncing in her lap, and the businessman on her other side nodded, his face tight with approval. The older man's video was spreading fast, tweets exploding across the internet. The hashtag United Airlines now paired with words like bias and injustice. Jessica's hands trembled, the directive crumpling in her grip, her eyes darting from the captain to Karoline to the passengers, as if she could still find a way to hold her ground. But the truth was out, undeniable, and it was louder than her protests. Karoline's heart pounded, not with triumph but with a heavy clarity. She thought of the countless others who'd faced moments like this, judged, dismissed, pushed aside without a voice. Her role as press secretary gave her a platform. But this wasn't about her title. It was about the pin on her bag, the legacy of her father, a senator who taught her that power was only as good as the fairness it served. She could have stayed silent, let the moment pass, kept her head down to avoid the spotlight. But silence would have been safety at the cost of truth, and Karoline had never been one to hide. Sarah stood closer now, her clipboard set aside, her face bright with a mix of awe and resolve. She looked at Karoline as if seeing her for the first time, and Karoline offered a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. The captain turned to Jessica, his voice firm. "You'll report to headquarters when we land," he said. And Jessica's shoulders slumped, her face a mask of disbelief. The passengers' phones kept flashing, the video now viral, comments pouring in, calling out United's bias, demanding accountability. The climax hit. A wave crashing over the cabin. Jessica's prejudice was exposed, laid bare for all to see, and there was no turning back. Karoline leaned against her seat, her eyes drifting to the window, the clouds now tinged with the first hints of dusk. The pin glinted, a small reminder of who she was, not just to the world, but to herself. The cabin cheered again, softer now, a murmur of support. But Jessica stood alone, her authority stripped away. The captain returned to the cockpit, and Sarah stayed near Karoline, her presence a quiet alliance. The plane flew on, but the world below was already shifting, the truth spreading faster than the flight itself. What would United do to save face? The plane began its descent, the hum of the engine softening as the world below came into view, a patchwork of lights against the dusk. Karoline Leavitt sat back in her rightful first-class seat, the leather cool against her back, a small reclaiming of what had been taken. The eagle pin was tucked away now, safe in her bag, but its weight lingered in her mind, a reminder of her father and the legacy she carried. The cabin felt lighter, the earlier tension dissolving into a quiet hum of murmurs and the clink of cups. Sarah, the younger flight attendant, approached with a coffee, her hands steady now, her eyes soft with respect. "You didn't deserve that," she whispered, setting the cup down gently. Karoline's eyes glistened, not from anger but from the weight of being seen, of being understood. If you've ever felt invisible and then, suddenly, truly noticed, you know that ache. It's not triumph, it's relief, a breath you didn't know you were holding. She smiled faintly at Sarah, a silent thank you, and took a sip of the coffee, its warmth grounding her. The cabin was calmer now, passengers settling back, but the air carried a new energy, a sense of something shifted. Jessica Reed stood near the galley, her badge still pinned to her uniform but her authority stripped away. She was silent, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly as if to hold herself together. The captain's earlier words, "report to headquarters," hung over her. A sentence yet to be served. Across the aisle, the older man in the suit stood, his phone now tucked away, and approached Karoline. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp with the kind of wisdom that comes from years of watching the world unfold. "I'm Martin," he said, his voice low but clear. "Retired journalist. I've sent the video to my network. This won't be buried." Karoline looked up, her heart catching at the words. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't planned for the moment to spiral beyond the plane. But she nodded, her voice soft. "Thank you," she said, and Martin's eyes crinkled with a small smile. As if he'd seen moments like this before and knew their power, the plane tilted gently, the descent steady. But on the ground, the world was anything but calm. United's PR team was scrambling, their public apology already posted online, a carefully worded acknowledgement of an unfortunate incident that did little to quell the storm. The hashtag Boycott United was trending, fueled by Martin's video, now viral with millions of views. Comments poured in, stories of other passengers who'd faced similar dismissals, their voices rising in a chorus of outrage. Jessica's name wasn't public yet, but her suspension was confirmed. A quiet memo circulating among the crew. Karoline's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was her father, his name lighting up the display. She answered, her voice steady but soft. "Dad," she said, and his voice came through, warm and familiar, the kind of voice that had guided her through countless storms. "You made me proud, Karoline," he said, and she closed her eyes, the words wrapping around her like a blanket. "You didn't make trouble," he added, his tone firm but gentle. "You were in trouble." The twist landed softly, a truth she hadn't fully seen until now. She hadn't fought for herself alone, but for every person who'd been dismissed, judged, pushed aside without a chance to speak. Her eyes stung, a single tear slipping down her cheek, not from pain but from release. She thought of the pin, of her father's lessons, of the weight of her role as White House press secretary, not just a title, but a responsibility to stand for what was right. Sarah lingered nearby, her presence a quiet support, and Martin returned to his seat, his phone buzzing with messages from his network. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane prepared to land, and Karoline leaned back, her coffee still warm in her hands. The passengers around her were quieter now, some offering small nods of respect, others still typing on their phones. The story spreading faster than the plane could fly. Jessica stood alone, her silence louder than any words she'd spoken. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing the landing. But it was Karoline's words. "This isn't about me. It's about fairness," that echoed in the cabin, in the tweets, in the hearts of those watching from afar. The plane touched down, a gentle jolt, and Karoline's phone buzzed again, this time with notifications, messages of support, articles already picking up the story. The truth was out, and it was changing things, not with a shout, but with a steady, undeniable presence. She didn't need to gloat or demand more. She'd stood her ground, and that was enough. But how would this change? United's ways, Karoline Leavitt stepped off the United Airlines flight, her blazer slightly wrinkled but her head held high, her steps steady against the polished floor of the airport terminal. The hum of the plane faded behind her, replaced by the bustle of travelers, the clatter of suitcases, and the distant announcements echoing through Dulles International. The eagle pin was back on her bag, its faint glint a quiet reminder of her father and the strength she'd drawn from his legacy. The air felt different now, lighter, as if the weight of the earlier confrontation had lifted, leaving behind a clarity that settled deep in her chest. If you've ever walked away from a moment that tested you, knowing you stood for something bigger, you'd understand that feeling, not victory, but peace. The kind that comes from doing what's right. Karoline's phone buzzed in her pocket, notifications piling up, but she didn't check it yet. She wanted this moment, this quiet walk through the terminal, to belong to her alone. The world outside was already moving fast. United's apology was plastered across news sites. A carefully worded statement promising policy reviews and a commitment to fairness. Jessica Reed's suspension had sparked debates, with commentators dissecting bias in service industries, their voices amplified by the viral video from Martin, the retired journalist. His footage, now viewed millions of times, had become a rallying cry, inspiring op-eds and think pieces on workplace prejudice, on the small, everyday judgments that cut deeper than they seem. Karoline didn't tweet or gloat, didn't add fuel to the fire. Instead, she'd posted one line before boarding. Simple and clear fairness isn't a privilege, it's a right. That single sentence had spread faster than she'd expected, shared and quoted, a spark that lit up conversations far beyond the plane. As she walked, her eyes caught glimpses of other passengers from the flight. The mother who'd sat next to her in economy offered a small wave, her toddler asleep in her arms. The businessman who'd nodded in support gave her a brief, respectful nod as he passed. They, too, were part of this now, their own stories spilling out online, tales of being dismissed or overlooked, a ripple effect that Karoline hadn't foreseen but felt deeply. She paused near a newsstand, the headlines already picking up the story, and her heart ached not for herself, but for those who'd faced moments like hers without a voice, without a pin, without a father whose name carried weight. She thought of Sarah, the young flight attendant who'd found her courage, and Martin, whose quiet resolve had turned a single video into a movement. They'd all been part of this, a constellation of choices that added up to something bigger. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she glanced at it. Messages from colleagues, friends, even strangers, poured in, their words warm with support. One stood out, from her father. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for what's right." She smiled, her eyes stinging, and tucked the phone away. The terminal stretched out before her, a sea of faces, each with their own stories, their own unseen battles. Karoline didn't need to shout or demand more. She'd let the truth speak, and it had been loud enough. Society was shifting, if only a little. United announced training programs to address bias, a direct response to the firestorm. Voices that had been quiet were now amplified, passengers and employees alike sharing their experiences, demanding change. The hashtag Boycott United had evolved into something broader, a call for accountability, for fairness in the small moments that shape lives. Karoline reached the exit, the cool evening air brushing her face as she stepped outside. The sky was deep blue, streaked with the last traces of sunset, and she paused, breathing it in. The pin on her bag glinted under the terminal lights, a small piece of her story, but not the whole of it. She wasn't just the White House press secretary, not just a senator's daughter. She was Karoline, a woman who'd chosen to stand, not for revenge, but for justice, for the kind of fairness that doesn't need a title to matter. The loudest truths, after all, are spoken softly, and hers had echoed far beyond the plane. She walked toward the waiting car, her steps light, her heart steady. The world was watching now, and it was listening. What would come next for those who'd heard her truth? Karoline's pin caught the terminal's light as she walked away, a small glint against the evening's quiet. The crowd moved on, but her steps left an echo, a truth that didn't need to shout. Justice wasn't in the applause, it was in the silence that followed. Did you feel it? That shift when fairness finally stood tall. Sometimes, The loudest truths are the ones spoken softly, carried not by anger but by the steady heart of someone who dares to stand.